Okay. Sure.
Might want to.
Just like wanting to 75.
It's always heard from, yeah.
Just to have that.
Like 1 year.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and get this meeting started. Welcome, everybody, to the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission Shellfish Crustacean Advisory Committee meeting on, January 9th, about 6 o'clock. At every meeting, the chair should recognize NCGS 138A-15E, which mandates at the beginning of every meeting of a board, the chair shall remind all members of their duty to avoid conflicts of interest under Chapter 138. The chair shall also inquire as to whether there is any known conflict of interest with respect to any matters coming before the board at that time. And so, does anybody have a conflict of interest? All right. I want to take a minute. We had a couple new advisors as well as a new commissioner, and I wanted to take a minute and just take to do some introductions, and I'll start that off. I'm Mike Blanton, current assistant commercial fishing representative on the Marine Fisheries Commission, out of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and I'm majority of the time blue crab. Mr. Service, if you would.
Hey, thank you, Mike. I'm Will Service. I am a new fisheries commissioner. I was appointed and attended my first meeting in November. I'm in a recreational seat. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'm pleased to be on. Pleased to be with you all tonight.
Start down here.
I'm Bersai Weston. I'm a commercial fisherman from Sneed's Ferry. We do sink net fishing. We also have aquaculture leases or franchise my parents do. So this is my second meeting. I was here in July.
I'm Brett Wilson. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Wilmington, where most of my research revolves around blue crab fishery.
I'm Mike Marshall from Morehead City. I'm a former division employee. Worked quite a bit with shellfish during my career there.
I'm Jeff Dobbs. I'm a co-lead for the clam species, and now I've moved on to an FMP coordinator position. I'm kind of lingering back here as a biologist with clams.
I'm Lorena, the other co-lead for clam and biologist out of the manual office.
I'm Spen Curtis. I'm a biologist in Morehead City office. I'm one of the co-leads for the oyster clam.
I'm Joe, the other co-lead, biologist in the Wilmington office.
I'm Coral. I'm the for the commission.
And I'm Jesse Bissett. I'm the Marine Fisheries Commission liaison for the division.
We have one advisor online, Mr. Willis, if you would.
Hi, Tim Willis. Actually, I've been on here for several years. Have a place in Marshallburg. Unfortunately, I'm in the western part of the state today, and I couldn't get there. And background is engineer, scientist, and I run a biopharma company.
I think it's everybody, Jesse, right? Okay, so we got a couple of items to take care of. We're going to vote on the agenda. And I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Got that. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes without dissent. And we're gonna need to vote on two sets of minutes. Do you want two motions or can we do it in one?
One motion is fine if nobody has any changes that they would like to make to the minutes.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve both meeting minutes.
Get a second.
Second.
Mr. Marshall, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes without dissent. Okay, I'm gonna turn the floor over to Jesse, and he's gonna lead us into the next bit of the meeting.
So before we actually get started with the presentation for this meeting, I did want to just give a brief update on virtual attendance for the advisory committee meetings. At your previous meeting, we discussed a little bit about a court of appeals ruling back in August that kind of called into question whether or not virtual attendance for official meetings of public bodies counted for quorum requirements, and if virtual members would be allowed to actually vote, and it was a little unclear, that ruling, how it would affect virtual participation for advisory committees, but we did receive some additional guidance, and from here going forward, we do expect to be able to allow virtual participation and virtual voting. So Mr. Willis, you are able to vote tonight if you choose to.
Yep, understood.
Okay, just one point of clarification, if the committee would please me on this. We're gonna try to hear since we have several members of the public here, we're gonna try to hear a presentation, and then if the public has an oyster fishery public comment to make, we're going to allow them, I would like to allow them to make that comment as the presentation sort of concludes. And then the same with the clam, so that would break up the public comment a little bit, or maybe pull it all in. Do we have an idea of how many speakers we actually want to speak?
We currently have 3 people signed up to
3,
speak.
okay, that'll be fine. Okay, so let's move on into the presentation, and we'll hand the floor over to the staff.
See you guys. Version.
I'll get this shared to WebEx and it'll pop up on that screen up there. I'm figuring out how to do it.
Password for the Wi-Fi here.
It lasts. All good? Okay. So I'll go ahead and start. As I said earlier, my name is Bennett Paradis, biologist in the Morehead City office. I'm one of the co-leads for the oyster plan. Joe's here with me. He's in the Wilmington office. So today we're going to talk to you about Amendment 5 and proposed management strategies for the Eastern Oyster Fishery Management Plan. So after we present on these ideas, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. So for perspective of where we currently are in the FMP process, here's the timeline. Back in July, we held a 3-day advisory committee workshop and incorporated edits into this current version of the plan. So the MFC has voted to send this version of the plan out for review. So today, this advisory committee is one of 4, which will review the draft of Amendment 5 to the Oyster Management Plan. And you'll vote on the proposed recommendations. Following the discussion and reviews held during these ACs, the MFC will then select preferred management options and the draft of the amendment will be sent for DEQ secretary and legislative review. Tonight, the main focus will be on the issue papers and the preliminary management recommendations proposed by DMF. This stage in the process allows for further review and discussion of ideas for management strategies concerning oysters in North Carolina. The amendment itself is comprised of a base plan, and that provides background information on the biology of the species, a description of the fisheries, an economic impact summary, and an overview of the oyster resource as important habitat. There are also several appendices that provide further detail on DMF management policies and enhancement programs. The management strategies that are proposed in the recreational harvest issue paper and the mechanical harvest management issue paper are the topics that we would like to focus on tonight, as these are areas that we have focused on for revising within this amendment. So we're going to talk about Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 in order. So we'll start with Appendix 1, which is the recreational shellfish harvest. The number of recreational shellfish harvesters in North Carolina is currently unknown, which makes it extremely difficult to estimate the total recreational harvest. An issue acknowledged in all past eastern oyster and hard clam plans is the inability to accurately estimate the amount and extent of recreational shellfish harvest in the state. Due to the widespread accessibility of intertidal oysters and clams along North Carolina's coast, the potential impact of recreational harvest could be significant, and this results in a large data gap in landings information. The division is striving to establish the best available data sources across the fishery to complete a stock assessment. Given that North Carolina's shellfish fisheries are exclusively under state jurisdiction, a lack of recreational harvest data makes it extremely difficult to address potential management issues, including harvest limits, size limits, and year restrictions for this fishery. North Carolina and Virginia are the only two states without some form of license, local permitting, or residency requirement for recreational shellfish harvest. Another concern for not having a license requirement for recreational harvest is the inability to easily communicate health concerns associated with harvest from temporary or permanently closed polluted areas. Shellfish harvest areas are highly regulated by NCDMF's Shellfish Sanitation section for human health and safety. This section is responsible for classifying all coastal waters as to their safety for shellfish for human consumption. Within coastal waters, areas are classified as approved, conditionally approved, restricted, or prohibited. These classifications are used to keep consumers healthy and safe. So as no license is required for harvest, participants are often unaware of stipulations and or closures and are unable to be targeted with educational material. Having a separate license for recreational harvesters could automatically link to essential information updates on the safety for recreational harvest areas. In summary, creating a specific recreational shellfish permit would provide DMF with a complete pool of recreational harvesters. That list could then be used as a survey frame to help determine the effort in the fishery, the recreational fishery, as well as the total harvest that occurs. This would allow for distribution of educational materials and information at the point of sale to any potential recreational harvesters. Additionally, having a list of the population of recreational harvesters would also be useful to help distribute closure proclamations and maps. If shellfish species get added to the already existing cruffle, then the activity survey during the sale of the cruffle would still need to be conducted to identify those fishers that participate in recreational shell fishing, and then those participants could be sent additional surveys to determine effort and harvest estimates for the recreational shellfish fishery. In order to pursue any one of these potential solutions, a significant amount of time and effort will need to be expended by DMF to assess internal program, resource capabilities, as well as limitations. Any potential desired legislative changes require a specific process, and those are ultimately outside the scope or outside DMF or MFC control. So to best solve this issue, DMF proposes that the division explore potential options and solutions outside the fishery management plan. And that's all that we have for the recreational issue paper. So next we'll segue into mechanical oyster harvest, and I'll hand it off to Joe to speak on that.
So this appendix in the draft FMP, there's a lot of information in there. And to kind of go into it with all the detail would take well over an hour because we've done it before, but I'm gonna try to give you as much of the information as possible. And any details on the questions we can discuss later on, when you, in the question period. And plus in the actual draft document, there's lots of background information. But just the kind of some initial background information. So managing oyster mechanical harvest, North Carolina, we don't have a traditional stock assessment for oysters in the state. However, we've been, successfully managing oysters to have continued harvest on them, sustaining harvest for centuries now. But kind of one real simple approach to sustainably managing oyster harvest is to look at the amount of material removed from oyster reefs versus what's able to grow on its own or what we put back. So oysters are unique in that they grow their own habitat. So they require a hard substrate to grow on, but they grow and are their own hard substrate to grow on. So if you kind of remove more of those oysters in that hard substrate than can grow back naturally, or you replenish, you'll have a reduction in the overall number of oysters. So to kind of maintain that balance of what's removed and what can grow naturally or is supplemented is kind of one way to look at sustainably managing oyster harvest. Again, oyster dredges, we're looking at just addressing management for the mechanical fishery of the subtidal oyster stocks that are wild in Pamlico Sound. This FMP is only looking at wild harvest. And mechanical harvest methods like oyster dredges, they do offer a very efficient means of harvesting oysters. However, since they're potentially so damaging to that oyster habitat, we need to carefully manage and take consideration of those potential negative impacts. And so in this appendix, looking at addressing mechanical harvest management, there's kind of three issues that we're looking to address here. The first is kind of looking at habitat damage, and that's the origination of that is the Commission's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan identified mechanical harvest gears as having the potential to be highly destructive to oyster reefs. And the division was directed through the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan by the Commission to kind of look at ways to minimize these habitat impacts from the gear. The second piece we're looking at is kind of addressing concerns brought up by the industry and how we currently manage the mechanical fishery through the trigger sampling program. And the third piece we're looking at is officially incorporating the extensive culture planting program we have in the state into our fishery management plan and management process. So the existing strategy, how mechanical harvest is currently managed, we actively monitor the harvest areas, and the goal is in real time go out there and sample areas that are actively being fished with mechanical gear to monitor the condition of the oyster resource. So there's the threshold of 26% legal has been set. That's the threshold when the oyster resource, those reefs, the habitat condition falls below that, those areas are closed. And that 26% legal threshold was determined through two FMPs ago as kind of the point at which the destruction of that oyster habitat and pulling up the culture material to get the amount of legal oysters left when it's less than 26% isn't worth the actual harvest that you're getting. So it's kind of a habitat protection measure there to make sure that we leave enough oyster habitat there for oysters to then grow and kind of recover. With that said, the season length, oops, wrong one, sorry. The goal of this harvest monitoring is to follow those areas that are actively being fished. And when this strategy was adopted in 2010, participation in the fishery was much greater. However, in recent years, participation has been dropping, and it's been harder for the division to find those areas that are actively being fished to kind of sample where the fishing is occurring. And additionally, there's a break in the potential 6-week season in the bay where there is no fishing, in the bays where there is no fishing occurring. So we're not able to even sample where there's fishing occurring since there's none. And sometimes, there's oyster reefs condition can vary pretty greatly across the sound. And so sometimes given lower participation and just that variability, the industry doesn't feel that where we're sampling is often representative of the areas actually being fished. So currently the season length is determined by the sampling and the conditions of the oysters in the sound. So while the potential harvest season can run mid-November through March, the actual length that harvest is allowed in each of those management areas is variable between years. So if the resource has been impacted through fishing or storm events, there can be large variability where one year the season could last 2 weeks, another year it could last the entire potential time through March. But the way we close the season is through proclamation. So at the beginning of the season, fishers don't have an idea of how long that season's actually going to be, and they're waiting for us to issue proclamations. And sometimes they can potentially issue a proclamation and close within 72 hours. And so, for instance, after the impacts from multiple hurricanes, the mechanical harvest season in Pamlico and Neuse management areas was only open for 10 days in 2019 and the 2019-2020 season. Yet in 2021-22 season, it was open for 8 weeks. So this uncertainty and the variability in season length is viewed unfavorably by harvesters. So historically, these reefs in Pamlico Sound, some in the deep water areas, were reported to reach up to 13 feet off the bottom. But however, in these reefs in the Neuse and Pamlico rivers have been shown to suffer mass mortality at depths because of low oxygen events and storms. So those deep water reefs are suffering mortality while the shallow water reefs are not. And additionally, reefs in deep water that can reach off the bottom high enough to be above that low dissolved oxygen water, they don't show any of that mortality. So mechanical gear has been shown in research to be able to effectively remove height from reefs pretty quickly. And so in order for those reefs to recover in those deep areas to kind of grow above that low dissolved oxygen water, they need to be able to gain height and potentially mechanical harvest at the levels that it might be occurring, maybe preventing that. Besides the height of reefs, just the abundance of reefs in Pamlico Sound have been greatly reduced. And we know historically from information from mapping that there used to be a lot more in the 1880s. And when we've gone back and re-looked at some of those sites that are identified as oyster reefs now that were used to be high profile, they just consist of low profile shell rubble. So kind of just a low shell hash on the bottom. Sometimes they're low density reefs, or even they're just buried and there's nothing there anymore. So these large shallow reefs that are kind of low complexity now have less live oysters. And so it's these declines in reef height have been attributed to decades of fishery effort. So this map here shows the division's culch planting efforts. So kind of our strategy for supporting oyster growth and harvest has been to add that hard material, whether it be shell or rocks, back to the sound as a place for oysters to attach and grow. But you can see all our culch planting efforts are those different dots on there, and they're primarily focused around the perimeter in the bays of kind of western Pamlico Sound and around the backside of the Outer Banks, with no culture planting effort occurring in those deep water areas in the middle. So this figure here shows the amount of culture material that's been planted into areas of Pamlico Sound that are open to mechanical harvest through time, as well as those are the gray bars, and the black line shows oyster harvest. So between 2000 and 2022, over 2.1 million bushels of culture material were planted in the mechanical harvest areas of Pamlico Sound, while only just under 500,000 bushels of oysters were mechanically harvested. So thinking about that, making sure that we don't remove more material than can grow back naturally, so oysters have a place to set on. We've actually put in 4.8 times more bushels of culture material in those areas that have been planted than oysters were mechanically harvested in that time. And if you zoom in even closer, since 2018, when we've kind of had increased funding to that culture planting program and stepped up what's been planted, 36 times more bushels of culture have been planted in Pamlico Sound compared to oysters commercially harvested and removed. So a caveat on that is we don't know what the return in commercial harvest per unit of culture planted in North Carolina is. It likely varies across culture sites. Some maybe 1-to-1, might be less than 1-to-1, might be more than 1-to-1. We don't know, but we do know that some of these culture planting sites have persisted since for 30, 40 years or more. And that the majority of the kind of effort in the bays of all the culture planting areas you saw on the map, a lot of the harvest is coming from new or very old culture planting reefs out there. So we're kind of in the perimeter of Pamlico Sound where all that culture planting is occurring. We're supporting the oyster harvest there by replanting culture material in the Sound. However, our current management approach for mechanical harvest or harvest of oysters in general in North Carolina doesn't distinguish between oysters that are growing on division constructed culture planted reefs or wild naturally occurring reefs. So right now in Pamlico Sound, an oyster is an oyster, and we treat them the same whether it came from a culture planting or a wild historic reef that's out in that deep water. So as I said, the culture planting effort in Pamlico Sound, we've greatly exceeded how much we've put in for how much shell has been removed, but it's localized and only focused in those bays and areas that we're planting and not in the deep water. So there's been no culture planting in those deep water areas or restoration to kind of supplement what has been removed from those deep water reefs. And so since 2018, that 36 times more bushels of culture being planted by the division than oysters harvested is a pretty large disparity of what's planted for culture by what's harvested in commercial oysters. So we may not be best using the culture planting program by not differentiating between harvest from culture and wild reefs. And so to kind of address these three concerns of habitat, the current management, and kind of better incorporating the culture planting program into our fishery management process, the draft FMP has three proposed strategies that, in this appendix. The first one is strategy 1, water oyster recovery areas. And that's kind of to address the habitat concerns from the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan of mechanical harvest gear having negative impacts on wild oyster reefs. And this strategy prioritizes the habitat value of the oysters there over the fishery value of the oysters there. Strategy 2 is kind of how we're what we're doing now with some changes. It's culture supported harvest, and this strategy values the habitat value of the oysters and the fishery value equally. And strategy 3 is kind of looking at better incorporating our culture planting program. And it's creating rotational culture planting sites. And these sites, the fishery value of the oysters there are prioritized over the habitat value. And so we'll go through each one of those now. So strategy 1 is the deep water oyster recovery areas. And this was just a proposed strategy in the plan to kind of address those habitat concerns brought up in the Commission's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. So we do know that those deep water reefs in the Pamlico and Neuse River have suffered mass mortality from water quality impacts. And the last big events were kind of Hurricane Florence and Matthew in 2018. And our sampling had very few live or legal oysters since then, except for this year, which we're starting to see things come back in the Pamlico area. And that kind of lines up with what we're being told, how that area is utilized, where it's not, it doesn't support an annual fishery harvest, but once every 5, 7, 8 years, there's some potential oysters out there to be harvested. Again, those areas have had no culture planting efforts. So when the mechanical harvest happens, it removes more material than can naturally grow back. And we haven't planted any material out there. And we're currently not permitted to. However, that's something we can look into in the future. It's a possibility. So we identified 2 deep water oyster recovery areas that include these wild historical deep water reefs, and proposed that in order to meet those habitat protection goals outlined in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, that mechanical harvest in those areas would not be open. And so I'll go to those areas next, but we basically, the boxes are big because we had to use navigational markers to bound them as something that's already on the water for ease of enforcement. And so the first one here is the proposed Neuse River deep water oyster recovery area. And so the box looks huge, but what is actual potential oyster habitat? And I'll say potential oyster habitat means something since 1887 to 2007 that was mapped and identified as hard bottom or live oyster reef. A lot of those areas that we've gone back and looked at and re-examined are shell hash rubble and some oyster reefs there. So that's potential oyster reef area, and that's 180.6 acres, which represents less than 1% of that total box. So it's a big box, but within that box, there's a very small amount compared to the size of the box, less than 1% of potential oyster habitat. And of the potential oyster habitat, we're not sure what ratio of that is actual live oyster at the moment. We have some sampling information for the trigger sampling data, but we haven't gone to every single one of those red dots. The next one is the Pamlico River deep water oyster recovery area. And this one is 16,800 acres. And again, not all of that's oyster habitat. And we've identified out of that between 500 and 600 acres of potential oyster habitat again. And this one has a little more error around it because the Neuse River habitat was actually mapped in 2007, and this one hasn't been mapped yet. So there was a little extrapolation of those points to come up with that acreage. And so the proposed deep water oyster recovery areas, obviously recovery of these oysters won't occur overnight, potentially not even between FMP cycles. But as with any management strategy, it's would be applicable for this FMP cycle unless the commission reopen or change their minds. So at the next 5-year cycle of the FMP, we could evaluate, is this successful, and then determine if you want to move forward to this strategy or discontinue it or change something different. So we haven't identified kind of what success would mean for this, and that's something that we're kind of looking for feedback potentially from the advisory committee, kind of thoughts on what success criteria could potentially be, kind of maybe the long-term view of how this could work, potential harvest in the future or rotational strategy or just something. But again, that's given how long it will take for recovery, that's, we don't expect to see anything at least until the next FMP cycle and likely beyond. And so just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, this picture, I believe, was 2017. So these were taken in 2017 on the right. So that's even before the real anoxic events we had in 2018 and beyond, are one of those deep water reefs in the Neuse River, historic ones that have been basically reduced to kind of shell hash and rubble. You can see there's very few live oysters or very little relief or complexity. And on the left is a section of a oyster sanctuary in deeper water showing oysters in an area close to harvest, kind of forming a complex, higher relief reef that's better for not only oyster habitat, but habitat for finfish and vertebrates, all the other things we care about that utilize that oyster habitat in Pamlico Sound. So that second tier approach that we're talking about, strategy 2, the culture supported harvest areas, and this is essentially the management approach we're currently taking, except just modifying how we determine the season lengths. And so significant culture planting and effort has gone into those bays and all the sites you've seen around Pamlico Sound. So much so that we have the largest culture planting program in harvestable areas in the country. And so the goal of this is to encompass all the culture planting sites in the culture supported harvest area, and manage these sites as we're using culture to help replenish material that's removed for harvest and ensure sustained harvest of oysters in the Sound. Again, we would use the existing bushel limits, area management areas, season dates that have all been established in the prior FMPs and bring all that forward. But the thing that we're looking to change is replacing the trigger monitoring program and create fixed season lengths by area. And the goal of this is to eliminate the unpredictability experienced by harvesters of how long mechanical harvest would occur in any given season. It has the benefit of also freeing up some of our time to allow us to better answer some of those questions we need to better manage oysters and potentially work our way towards a fishery management plan someday. And so how this would work, it's outlined kind of in the issue paper how we came up with this, but we basically used the historic trigger data we had to look at the preseason condition of an area and how long it took for that area to reach that management trigger of 26%. And so what we found is that it was a pretty good relationship with how long it took an area to reach below 26% from what it started as. And that is contingent on, we'll get to there, on the effort being the same. One of the major complaints we have is that we're not sampling where the industry is fishing. So the first step in this new approach would be to have an official mechanism for receiving industry reports from mechanical harvesters. So we would have a dedicated voicemail box, email. Everyone can leave a phone call, leave a voicemail message, or email areas to sample, and that would inform us where we should do our preseason sampling. That's going to be vital for us to receive that information. If we don't receive any, we'll just rely on our past knowledge and kind of historical information and where we've seen harvesting occurring. But to really have it reflect, where the industry feels this is the best place for you to sample, we need that participation. So we get those preseason industry reports, which show us where to sample. We go out and do our preseason sampling. We would see what the condition of the oyster resource is in those areas, the 4 management areas, broken down by the 10 bushel a day bays and the deep areas where have the bays. And then a proclamation would go out and it would say what the season length is for those areas. And the season length, again, is based on the past data we have, and it's in the paper, and we can kind of look at that if you want to later, without going over it right now. So the season length would be set. The season would be open at the very beginning of the season. The proclamation would show for, each of the 4 management areas versus the bays when the season was going to be. Then, during the season, we'd like in-season industry reports of where, people are actually fishing and what's doing well. And we go out and do 1 in-season sampling to see what the condition is during the season. Then we come back, again, use the data we have and the season lengths that are set in the table in that paper. And if it looks like we undershot what the area could support by the oyster resource, we'd proclaim the season to be long, so we'd extend it. If it looks like we were right on, it would stay as is. And it looks like if we were too generous, that's too bad on us, it would stay as is. So in this strategy, there would be certainty from that proclamation of exactly how long the season was going to be, with potentially an extension, but no taking it back. And again, so this hopefully would provide some sort of a lot more certainty and more confidence in what we're doing, hopefully, if we get that participation from the industry. And so that third strategy is creating large rotational culture sites. So that map you can see right now, the red dots are the locations of our large 10-acre culture sites. So the culture planting program has already been building these. So they've been building large 10-acre culture sites in the areas open to mechanical harvest in Pamlico Sound. The goal is to have at least 16 sites planted by 2026. And there will be 4 in each of the mechanical harvest management areas. How these would be managed is that each site would be closed for 3 years and opened on the 4th through a rotational basis. So there would be at any given time 4 management areas, rotational culture sites open across all management areas. So each management area would have 1 mechanical site, rotational site open. Right now, the culture planting program is funded enough to be able to commit to 16 sites, so we'll have 1 open. If this is a strategy that works well and funding continues, there's no reason why we couldn't keep building more of these rotational culture sites and get more in rotation. Right now, as it stands, we can no problem commit to those 16 sites. They can be built. And so it takes a few years for legal oysters, generally around 3 to produce legal oysters. So it'd be closed for that first 3 years, open on the 4th to harvest, closed again. And depending how much is harvested and what the site looks like, it can be replenished with culture and allowed to grow for 3 more years. These sites would be open for the full potential season, so mid-November through the end of March, and they're all in the 15 bushel area, so they would not be subject to the season lengths that were set in strategy 2. So no matter what, there will be 4 rotational culture sites open in Pamlico Sound the entire season long. And then, so another piece of this is the adaptive management. And this applies just to that culture supported harvest area strategy. And again, so we based the fixed season lengths that we proposed are based on the effort that occurred between the 2017-18 season and the 22-23 season. So if the effort that's occurring in the fishery in the future changes significantly from what we saw during that time period, our fixed seasons may not be appropriate anymore. So this is kind of a fail-safe to allow us to come back between FMP cycles and look at the fixed season lengths we have if something crazy happens in the fishery. So for instance, right now, the average number of participants is 93. If it changes, drops by 25%, so it drops to less than 70. The season lengths we have might be too conservative, and we might want to extend them a little longer to better reflect the effort that's occurring. Or on the other side, if all of a sudden a ton of people jump in because our rotational strategy is amazing and there's oysters everywhere, we may want to shorten the season because there'll be, more people, more effort occurring than was occurring during the time where we looked at to set these fixed season lengths. So it's just kind of a fail-safe to be sure we don't get it totally wrong between the FMP cycles. And so with that, we can go over the preliminary division recommendations for each one of these strategies. For Appendix 1, recreational harvest, the preliminary division recommendation is to have the commission support the division to further explore potential options and develop a solution to quantify recreational shellfish harvest participation in landings, and to establish a mechanism to provide all recreational shellfish harvesters with shellfish sanitation and water quality, health and safety information outside the FMP process. So we're asking basically for the commission to give us their blessing and direction to go forth and explore all potential options. Because as we looked into each option, each one of them has some complexities, whether it be programmatic on our side or legislative on getting things on a license that are going to take time, and it's going to have to happen kind of beyond the scope of the time frame of what happens in the FMP process. And legislatively, that's outside of the commission control anyways. So in Appendix 2, of those 3 strategies we outlined, the preliminary division recommendation is to support and adopt deep water oyster recovery areas as defined in the issue paper. For strategy 2, that culture supported harvest, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt proposed culture supported harvest strategy as outlined in the appendix there. And the third one, the rotational culture sites, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt that rotational culture site strategy as outlined in the appendix. And for adaptive management, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt the adaptive management as outlined. And that only applies if that second strategy is adopted. So where we are now is kind of have you guys as the advisory committee discuss the issues and give us your feedback on kind of the proposed management and selected strategies from the division.
I had a couple of follow-up questions from our meeting in July. The first one was, I believe Abby, the biologist that was in attendance, had asked if the percent trigger was different for patent tongs versus side dredge, and how that affects your sampling protocol versus what the commercial fishery actually is able to come up with, because it is 2 different types of equipment that we're comparing the results from. And so I was wondering if you guys had a chance to look into that request.
So we do not currently use patent tongs to sample. We use a dredge, to sample. So yeah, we're using the same gear. And I guess that discussion was just kind of around, could we potentially switch to something like patent tongs? Because the culture planting program uses patent tongs to sample the reef sites. So if we could mesh things together, but I think that's kind of a discussion on how we do the sampling, which doesn't sound like we're going to
Continue.
go down that road. Yeah.
And then the only other question I had noted was Mr. Thomas Newman, who I believe was one of the commercial fishing representatives that was in attendance, had spoke extensively about the tracks of the dredges and how the oystermen dredge on these deep water reefs, which was very different than the description that was put out here. Because they do not dredge over the tops of it, and I think the way he was explaining it was that they dredge around the sides to prevent that. Was that something that they looked into at all, or just kind of non sequitur?
We didn't, I guess we looked at, and what we've seen is that there has been a decent amount of, it may not be linear all the time, but there is, going over the top, it's happening.
It is happening.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up. It's been 6 months, so I didn't know if they were like actually comparing those, or if those were just claims that were being made.
We did take, I hope you noticed, we took a lot of your
Yeah, no,
feedback and we modified a lot of our issues and how we presented it, so.
Any other questions?
I have, go ahead.
Good, on your, sampling for the end of the season. Traditionally, before the season, we would often go out for, we'll get a local fisherman, take us out, and we would run around, look at sites, so they would get an idea about what the orchard looked like, because the season was closed. So just wondering, you're gonna get pre-season input, but I don't know how the fishermen are gonna know where to tell you to go if they haven't been out there looking.
Well, they'll know what reefs they worked last year. They
Right,
should have a general idea of where they were working in previous years, which might help guide if they could make that connection to the actual fishermen without forcing it.
So I guess that's also why we added that. Initially, when it was developed, we thought, okay, we'll do a preseason sampling, have a fixed season length, and be done with it. But I think adding that in-season sampling is pretty important because of just that reason where, that preseason sampling may not really reflect what's going to happen in the season. So having that in-season sampling and getting those reports from commercial fishermen is pretty important.
I did have one. Oh,
Go ahead.
I was going to ask.
Hold on, one second. Go ahead, Mr.
I was gonna ask, our licensing requirements, where's sort of the line where legislative action will be required for licensing for recreational harvest? Because my understanding is there is a requirement for licensing that come through the legislature. Can you sort of define that boundary?
So to add any species to the existing coastal recreational fishing license require legislative action. To create a new license would require legislative action. To do a permit, it may be within the ability, we can issue permits. Permits for something recreational is uncharted territory. And if that permit is really a license, then it may also require legislative backing.
Is permit the direction you guys are thinking you might go?
We don't know. We started looking at permitting and it's spidered really fast into all sorts of issues. So
I can speak to that. Ideally, we would like to pursue a license. We need to get legislative backing. That's sort of part of the reason we're looking for the commission to back us up here, is to just give us a little traction here to bring it back to the legislature.
Could I ask what sort of the history is with the legislature? Is that something they typically are fairly responsive to?
So originally, when the CREFL rolled out, we had tried to include shellfish in that, and that was rejected by the legislature. At the time, they just didn't have that appetite for it, but it's a data gap. We've identified it every time we've looked at these fisheries, and we would like to include them in a license permit. A permit is doable, it's just very difficult and resource intensive for the division. Because the current CREFL structure is under the WRC's licensing software.
A follow-up question, has the division looked at the data gap or considered that the unreported commercial landings or unsold commercial landings are also possibly a significant data gap, and how that might compare to the recreational data gap? And has there been any consideration for trying to close that gap?
So now there's at least a mechanism for reporting unsold landings through the trip ticket program.
So,
But yeah, we haven't, so the potential for, recreational harvest, there's how many millions of people potentially that could go recreationally harvest versus, I don't know. I think the scale is probably not comparable, but that is a potential data gap.
And I will say the mandatory harvest reporting legislation that you've heard us talk about at different commission meetings, for commercial fishermen, that you would be required, commercial fishermen would be required to report on, in this case, fish includes shellfish. So if they harvest oysters after December 1st, 2025, they would be required to report them on a trip ticket. And if I'm understanding correctly, Joe, they currently do have the option to report their unsold harvest on a trip ticket. It's just not a requirement right now.
And I have another comment, unless you want, would you like this? I wonder if onboard observers have been considered as an advantage for fishermen and for the division, as a simpler way to gather data about where they're fishing and where. And I think the online, you started an online program, am I correct? You're talking about an online fishermen report where they're harvesting,
Yeah,
so that you can collect more accurate data.
be just as simple as an email or voicemail.
But it's not sort of systematic. It's just sort of a voluntary.
Yeah, so
Or
participation would greatly help us and hopefully the industry as well by directing us where to go.
I was wondering if that doesn't work for the fishing community, if maybe an observer would. I don't know, just something to consider. I know observers have a fraught history, but maybe it might be a situation where it works for both. Just a thought.
Is that economically advantageous in a situation where we're already low on funds to hire another person to come in and do another job?
Well, I don't think we'd be looking at, the division hasn't asked the fishermen to fund observers.
No, I'm not, I'm just talking about the industry as a whole, like as a department, who would be funding?
Oh, the department.
Right. Are those resources
Well, I'm
better
wondering-
allocated elsewhere?
Well, if they're out sampling anyway, you're sending a boat out and a crew out with a boat to collect samples, as opposed to putting somebody on board with it as a crew member on a fishing vessel. It's just a thought, and I don't think it's worthy of a whole lot of discussion, but I just thought I'd raise the issue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mr.
Oh,
Willis, go ahead.
on that question, are you talking mechanical harvesters or people who do manual harvesting?
Mechanical, I think, is what we're talking about.
There's now again, I don't know Pamlico Sound, but down in Core Sound, I was just down there hunting, and I talked to oysterers there about this. I knew this was coming up. I mean, there's not that many mechanical harvesters in the entire sound. A couple maybe 2 handful at the most. So, I mean, it would seem to be logical and easy to do that from it. And I guess the question of it is this another situation where, like we talked with the shrimp thing, of those 70 or 80 people who are doing mechanical harvesting in the state, 90% of them are over 55 years of age. Is this so? From that, I guess that it would seem that they would be willing to help you with this. Or could you put it as part of they got to get a commercial fishing license? Could it be part of that, the requirements there?
we hadn't really considered, I mean, I think it's always there as a potential option, but we definitely hadn't considered requiring observers or anything for this fishery in the development of this issue, just given the history we've had having observers go on trips where that fishery is basically federally mandated to have observers where things are needed. It's been problematic. So someplace where it's not needed, I'm not sure how that would go on.
Okay, understood. All right.
Yeah.
I
Additional
can't
question?
find it in the previous paperwork, but I believe we had discussed that isn't recreational harvest protected on a socio disadvantage? There's some special legal jargon that protects it for the residents of North Carolina.
So I think that may have been when shellfish were removed from the coastal recreational fishing license when it was created, I think that may have been the concern, but you can get, there's a subsistence waiver you can get with the current recreational fishing license to not have to pay. So you get a free license. So it wouldn't be, if you needed one, you could get that waiver and it would still be available.
But currently, it's not. It's just your right as a North Carolina resident to go out and gather clams or oysters for your family.
I
Correct?
mean, currently now, as anybody, resident, non-resident, anyone can go out and get a
Okay.
recreational limit of, we have no requirements.
Would that be something that the division could look at as protecting for our North Carolina residents to preserve that right? But maybe creating a permit for out-of-state users. I know that we have a lot of tourism on our coast here that might need that information about shellfish sanitation, closures, and being able to get that out, because, you know, a lot of our locals already know to check and call and to ask so-and-so down the road who's a farmer, who knows? But maybe you're getting those outsiders to get that information, which is gonna get it into the communities by just having it up in places.
And so that wouldn't be unprecedented. Other states have residency requirements, and that could be
Right.
something. Basically, at this stage, we're just looking for a endorsement from the commission and direction to, yes, do this. So that way, whatever avenues we explore has the commission backing and hopefully better supported through the legislature. So yeah, we're like 6 steps before even trying to figure out what we've looked, and we started. When we opened this FMP, I was real optimistic, like, yeah, we can do something. And then the more we looked, the more it tendrils grew.
Good.
Go for it.
I know you guys mentioned metrics of success. I was curious, particularly with the deep water recovery areas, if those stores were to be adopted, would there be a way to still monitor or, assess how effective that strategy was over time?
Yeah, we would likely scan those reefs before and after and within subsequent years. And we ideally we would like to go and dive on them too and collect oyster metrics on it. We're looking for reef height and oyster density would be the main metrics, most likely.
If I could ask if you achieve what you're looking for with the reef, you get the recovery that you're looking for, has there been thought given to whether or not those recovery areas would be opened to harvest at some point?
That's up to the commission at that point or whenever, right? That's if we've met the success criteria, say we, successfully recover the reefs to whatever that point is. If harvest was again opened up on it, ideally it would be managed to not get back to the point we're at. So some sort of sustainable harvest on there. And what that looks like is it's something, but yeah, it's not, just because they're closed right now, if this is adopted tomorrow, it doesn't mean that it's adopted forever. It's a strategy to recover the reefs to then do as the commission will whenever, that at some point in the future, whether it's, the next FMP cycle and we haven't met any success criteria and the commission decides that this is no longer a strategy we want to pursue, or it's working and they want to give it more time, or whatever, we've reached a threshold and then it's harvestable, that's kind of wide open at this point. Again, think the thought process behind the deep water oyster recovery areas is that these deep water oyster reefs are the most vulnerable habitats to the mechanical harvest gears. So as we're directed by the commission, is to look at ways to minimize those gear impacts to that habitat. So the deep water oysters, since they're also vulnerable to those low dissolved oxygen events, they're kind of the ones that are really most impacted by that mechanical harvest gear, because it's pretty efficient at removing them and reducing height. Whereas in those shallow bays, we're putting a lot of material out there to kind of make up for what's removed. Plus, we don't see those anoxic events in the bays. And the reefs are more of a kind of spread out. They don't need to be high off the bottom to be above those storm events where there's no oxygen.
Do you think we need some sort of target, either in terms of a timeline or performance of the reef somehow? Do you think that should be part of this, the plan?
I mean, that could definitely be something we put in here.
What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think whatever that may be, it won't be apparent until at least the next plan, right? Like, we're gonna need that entire FMP cycle to see something happen. Because I mean, right now we're on a 5 to 8 year cycle as it is, with those dissolved oxygen events, recovery, harvest, dissolved oxygen events. So we take, it would be good, to be able to look at areas that no harvest occurs over the next whatever time, versus where there is harvest occurring in those similar areas, and be like, okay, yes, we do some remote sensing and there's greater height, greater hardness. We know this is different. Then there could be metrics like that.
That makes sense. And thanks for the presentation. Great presentations.
I've got a question or two if everybody. What additional restrictions would occur inside the door?
With this,
So if you're going to protect the shell habitat and try to grow the reefs, what additional restrictions would fall inside that DORA area? Because at that point, there would likely be an argument that any additional gears allowed within that area could potentially be harmful or detrimental to affecting the growth of whatever it is that would occur inside that of the oyster reef.
So
I was just curious to know what additional restrictions have been mentioned, offered, possibly retained.
with what's as proposed now would just be oyster mechanical harvest, because I mean, it's targeting oysters and removing them, and it's targeting reefs, and by removing them, it's lowering their height just by harvesting them, right? And we're not putting any additional material out. So right now, as proposed, is just that. If in other plans or it's thought that any bottom disturbing gear out there would be inappropriate, then that could be something the commission chooses to do. But right now, in this, it's just looking at oysters and that mechanical harvest gear, because that's what it's mechanically removing. So like a shrimp trawl is probably not doing as much damage to an oyster reef, but and not being targeted, at least, I don't think.
I feel like a shrimp trawl is gonna be damaged by an oyster reef.
Right. No, I just was curious to know. And so a follow-up question. So strategy 2 and 3 seem to somehow have the same name, and I can't figure out how they work together.
So
can you help me understand, or help the committee understand how strategy 2 and 3 works together? So if we're going to rotational harvest, which has been utilized quite a bit, and especially in like Chesapeake Bay, where they open a river, close the rest of the rivers, and so like each year one river is open and I'm sure you understand. And then so your strategy 2, which is incorporating the current cult sites in the bays. So I'm trying to understand how 2 and 3 work together.
So 2 is the goal of 2 is to not to basically prioritize oyster habitat and oyster fishery resource. So that trigger of 26% is saying that, okay, we've reached a point where the habitat has been degraded by removing oysters, that we're going to close the fishery in this area. The rotational approach is we're saying these specific sites are yours to do as you will with them. You may remove every single legal oyster off it because we're prioritizing their fishery value over the habitat value.
One of the main distinctions is the season length, right? So those, like strategy 2, the season length is going to be like predetermined. However, the rotational close sites will be open for the entire time.
Right, and those are specifically the 10 acres would be boundary marked. Hey, these are the boundary markers, I would assume.
Potentially,
I'm just trying to, as a fisher, how do they know they're legal to go to these
yeah, those coordinates.
And so in that rotation or in this other COPE zone, I mean, is this going to be a detailed map?
Oh, yeah.
With overlay and outlines and all the things?
The coordinates will be shared for the rotational harvest sites. Though there may be buoys for the sites that are closed for that year to signal these are off limits, and then the site that is open won't have a marker on it.
And so, yeah, the proclamation that goes out will be a lot more deep with this, especially describing with the 2-tiered, like the multiple strategies there and the 4 different areas. It'll be very detailed and hopefully easier to understand, but with lots of maps and coordinates.
Gotcha.
So it'll have to be, pretty detailed.
Right, be a comprehensive deal.
Yeah.
How does that work for, like, we were looking at the map, you had some spots in low side and some spots. That's a lot of gas in a boat, or it's a lot of driving with a boat that might not be able to make it there, on a trailer with. So if they close the sites that are near your home or your working waterfront area where you can access the water with your vessel, how would that affect the fishermen? Would it put them out of business if their cult sites closed that year because they can't make it to the other side of the Pamlico?
I mean,
I'm not from the area, so I'm really often asking that question.
There would be one in each management area, but yeah, I mean, that's one in a pretty big area. So ideally, I mean,
Doesn't seem like a way people can make an income.
I will say that we're sending out a flyer for people who participate in mechanical harvest. And within that flyer is basically proposed site selection for the cult sites. That includes the remaining 10-acre sites.
And
so it wouldn't be just, well, it potentially could be just those sites open, but if it was just those sites open, it meant that the other ones either, were at such a condition where they'd be closed. So it's not relying just on those sites. Those sites are in addition to, and the rotational aspect is to kind of, so when that site opens, the thought is it would have 3 years of being closed and those oysters are ready to go and should be pretty high density because they were all even aged and ready to just no competition except from, our cult sites, when sampled, have generally been a lot more productive. I forgot what the figure is, than wild sites when they're sampled kind of after that 3 years.
have the cult sites experienced any hypoxic events? Have we seen any natural deterioration to the cult sites that we're proposing moving our commercial fleet into?
They're already using all of those sites. So a lot, I would say probably the majority of the fishery effort that's occurring in Pamlico Sound, especially in the bay, is from a cult site, whether it be new or 40 years old. I think most of the oysters out there can probably trace, a good chunk of those oysters can trace their origin to something we threw out and then a reef has established. So,
So we're talking about regulating what's already available to the industry.
which we already do, we just do it as a reactive way by monitoring what's happening every 2 weeks. And this would switch to a kind of prescribing a season length based on all that data we'd collected from doing all this monitoring for years. So we have a pretty good idea of potentially how long a season's gonna last, just based on what it looks like in the beginning. And
I think there's a little confusion between the 10-acre culch site and then the other culch sites.
yes,
So we're not talking about rotating the current culch sites that are available. Those would still be available in a similar program, where the only change we're proposing there is a more efficient season triggered program. The new sites that we would be providing would be 10 acres, one in each region, open per year, 4 total in each region. This would be additional areas for fishers to access. So we're not looking to restrict the culch sites any further. We're actually trying to open up more culch sites for harvest. We're providing more resource for the commercial fishermen.
yeah, so the 2018 on, we've been planting 30 whatever percent or 30 something times more culch that's been harvested. So kind of having those 10-acre sites open the full time, the thought is that we'll be better utilizing what's out there for culch planted sites to allow harvest on, because all those sites in the bays, while the lines of what's wild and culch planting has been blurred. So ideally we could open a lot more culch sites a lot longer, but it's hard to tell what is what at this point, even though I'm pretty sure a lot of it is culch planted. That 10-acre approach is starting, like, getting our toes in the water of this is stuff we made for harvest it, close down, harvest, close down, as a way of better using all that culch planting that's going on while still protecting, the habitat in those in the bays, as well as that deep water area.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
All right, I'm gonna look to the public, I think, and ask if they have any comment on the oyster plan. So we had some folks sign up to speak. Is there anybody that wants to speak directly on the oyster plan? Yes, sir.
My name's Larry Gill. I've been oystering all my life, and I had a few questions. The deep water, you said you're gonna plant mulch, culch, whatever out there where the lumps are already at, right?
Right now, no. So that's part of the problem, is that we don't put anything out there.
But I mean, that's what you propose to do.
We could potentially look into that. That's not off the table, but right now, it would take a different suite of permitting, but it's possible. It's just right now we can't do that. So we're proposing closing them and letting them potentially naturally try to recover.
But they would do that without closing them, because, let me finish, because oystermen don't work where there's not any oysters. They're not out there dragging dead shells off the top of oyster lumps. The only oystering is done is where oysters are back and they're catching them. I've caught thousands of bushels out there. Bluff Shoal, a few years ago, you couldn't catch an oyster down there. You didn't see one, a little one or nothing. And a few years later, I went down there through my dredger, made one circle, and had 2 shrimp baskets full, that big. Mike Marshall knows it. Leave the place alone, it'll come back. I've got dots on my plotter, 1,000 of them, and very few have I erased because over the years they never came back. The place will come back if it catches over, and if we don't have hurricanes and this, but all that, closing it's not going to stop any of that. It's not going to stop hurricanes. It's not going to stop blight. It's not going to stop derma or MSX or whatever that stuff is. The only time we didn't ever have any oysters is when disease killed them. To get to the communication thing, when Mike was running the oyster program, he didn't have to email me or any of that stuff. When I came in, he was standing on the dock He said, hey, how's the oyster? I want to go to the city, we're gonna close, say for instance, we're gonna close oyster. Say, no, Mike, don't close oyster. Take me out there and show me why we shouldn't close oyster. Show me where oysters are. Show me how good it is. Not, he took it home with him when he went, evidently, because I don't see any of that happening now. And I'd be glad to do it, and he knows and I know, we didn't agree on everything. But, matter of fact, we didn't agree on lots of it. But anyway, we agreed on the fact that there's no problem with getting help, with getting people to go out there. Did you ever have any trouble? Did I ever not take you if you, I mean, I'm trying to get you to go. Let me show you where some oysters are.
Right. For the season stuff, no, not at all. I never had any trouble getting anybody to go. Absolutely.
And even if you did try to go out there and build the lumps up in that deep water, it's mud out there. It's mud. Go dump a bunch of rocks out there and see what you get. Everybody knows that planting rocks are good. On hard bottom, 6 to 10 foot of water. Works wonderful. I've made a lot of money. Appreciate it. It's the greatest thing ever been. Not 18 foot of water in the mud. It won't work. Closing it is not going to accomplish anything. It's come back a little bit. You said so yourself. You also said we've been working out here with dredges for centuries. Oysters have come and gone different places. Everybody knows it. And it'll keep on doing it if we leave it alone.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Who does have next? Go ahead.
I'm Dale Newman. Reiterate a lot of what Larry said. There is a disconnect between fishermen and marine fisheries. There used to not be so much. I actually called down there about a week ago. Had to call the mayor's office trying to find out who was in charge of oysters. Back then, I knew who was in charge of oysters. I knew who everybody down the line, even the salmon. If they called, they asked an opinion, and you gave it to them, whether it was good, bad, or ugly. If they wanted to go out, they got to a guy. Mike's been on the boat with me. We're using Mike here because he's here. There's been several other ones too, and again, we didn't always agree on things. Didn't even come close most of the time. But there is a disconnect there. But maybe it's both of us' fault. But we need to get better at it. We do need to come together some. If y'all are in charge of the oysters, the sampling and the seasons, talk to us. I mean, we don't mind it. We don't mind talking with you. We don't mind showing you. Yes, there's going to be one every once in a while. There isn't everything. There's going to be one of y'all every once in a while who's going to deal with this. Yes, that's just the way life is. They're closing these places. We've got a very good model to look at from places being closed to dredges. Maybe 25 years ago, we closed all them bays over home. Huh? Is that about right?
Right.
Maybe 25 years ago. They're dead, gone, nothing in them. We closed them, took mechanical dredging, they sealed it over, it's gone. No habitat, no oysters, no nothing. It's just the way it is. You've got to do a little bit around it. The rotating areas, I'm not opposed to that. But maybe we should put this coach that we're talking about putting out in some of these bays we closed and start rotating them up. See if we can't bring them back. Get them in that 6 to 8 foot of water that I was talking about on the edge of the bottom. And rotate. These are huge bays. I mean, I don't know how many acres it was, but it was huge. And y'all can go back and see it. Fine. But they never opened the back up because they never came back. They're just gone. Those places were oystered regularly at the time they were closed. And right now, no, there's nothing there. The boys with tongs can't find anything. It looks like your Barron picture did when you had the 2 slides side by side. That's what those oyster reefs look like, but they were closed. Mechanical dredges didn't do that to them. They aged out, basically, and then sealed it up. We have a sealing problem as much as anything in our area. When these places aren't worked, they sealed up. when an oyster lump or reef, or how you wanna call it, silts up, it don't take a catch. When it don't take a catch, it don't get any bigger. That's just kind of the way it is. You don't have an event to clean them before spat time, they don't get anything. Managing oysters has been something, some of the people in this room has been in for as long as Mike's been in. We were there when he was there, when he first got there, and we tried to help the whole time, some kind of way. So managing oysters with this group of people is not a new thing. The new thing is not looking back at what we've already done, like close these places, and saying this didn't work. Now, why are we looking at closing more? A new thing is not knowing who to contact to talk to about this stuff. This is what's new in the oyster management stuff for us. We've got your catch data. You've got to understand that a lot of these years that you're using catch data for, the season was closed very early. What was it closed? January 10th last year? Mechanical season for our area. Boys were catching their oysters. The markets aren't as good. We don't have as many people doing it. You have 15 bushels. So your catch data is comparing apples to grapefruits. And these low catch numbers are not consistent to the amount of oysters we have. We have oysters. We're just not catching. We're not working these places as long. We're not catching as many oysters as we used to per boat, per day. And I don't know, like I say, we need to look at some of our past management measures and say, did this work or did this not work? And when it didn't work, and you can't show that it worked, don't put it back in somewhere else. Don't redress it and sell it as a new item. Because it didn't work there. I don't know. Hopefully it will work. I mean, I'm rooting for you. Like Larry said, I appreciate what you do. But use us. We're a good source of information. Use us.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
I know there's a disconnect between the division and the oyster fishermen. What would be the best way for us to reconnect and be able to, we're here, we're asking, we're saying, we want to hear from you before the season, during the season.
I'll give you my phone number.
So
y'all say there's 90, I believe y'all.
Our problem lately has been like cold calling seems to be ineffective when we go down a list of harvesters on a trip ticket sheet. A lot of us are newer and younger, and we don't have the history with you. And establishing this relationship is hard. When we lose this previous generation of managers, that knowledge of the conversations with the fishermen is lost. It's difficult to reestablish. I would like to encourage you to, please call if you have any ideas ever pertaining to the management, or you have ideas about where we should be sampling. If you let us know, we can be more effective in this trigger sampling.
Okay. I'll leave you my number. That's not an issue. I would love to leave you my number. I saw a graphic there that said you have like 96% participants in Pamlico sign in the oyster dredging industry. Is that an average of 96 or something? Is that 98? I can't remember.
It was an average.
93?
It was
25 to 30% of that every year leaves out of the ditch that's on board. 25 to 30% of the total number that you're saying you have leaves out of one ditch. There's any day down there. Your marine patrol officers know the people. They know who. So, I mean, like I say, we're there, and I would gladly leave you my number. I have no issue with that. But I did call last week. I called quarter call.
Well, before you get out of here, make sure you drop the number with these guys, and if y'all want
I've
to connect.
still got his number, so you can call me.
Yeah, that's what I say. We talked a lot. And most of the people that's in this room that's oyster back then, that's talked to Mike a lot. We're just not,
Out of curiosity, were you able to get a hold of anybody involved with oysters?
Nope.
No?
nope.
What happened? I'm curious how.
I called, the man that I talked with gave me what proclamation was closing the bays. He said it weren't finalized, so I didn't know where I was going. He gave me a number. I'm not gonna say whose number he gave me. I called the number, left a message. I have not had a return call. And that's, and I've not heard any of y'all's names. And I mean, when you call, I'm not, it sounds like I'm pointing fingers, but I'm not
No,
really.
you're fine. No, I'm trying to understand the issue. I want to get the communication going.
Right, and that's where we need to get to. Like I say, I don't know. Anyway, I'm done. But I will leave you my number.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
appreciate
Chairman.
it.
How about a number to call right now? Can you give out one?
Yeah.
Give us a number. The numbers I call, it says, we're not here right now. We'll call you back or we can, whatever, and it never happened.
Can you pull up that slide, Jesse?
And
Yes,
this
I'll-
fisherman never answers his phone.
Okay. I answer damn phone enough, it won't bother me.
I would say, we have a younger generation coming into the division. There are things like mass email and mass text. You can text 93 people at one time now with the click of a
Settle
button.
down here.
You could.
We got to keep going with this public comment.
I mean, I oystered a little bit when I first started work. I've been a commercial fisherman all my life. I'm 62 years old. I oystered the first 2 or 3 years after I got out of school. Then I went on to bigger and better things. And I'm kind of semi-retired now, got back into oystering. And the first thing on the plan I said is where you're talking about trying to do, you talk about all the problems with the deep water oyster. That lack of oxygen and all that. You got all that stuff draining out of these rivers now that drain down on it. And you want to try to raise them lumps back up to 12 or 13 foot. There'll be dinosaurs again, time you get them up there dead. And I come by the state boat about 2 weeks ago in the fog one day. I don't know if one of y'all might have been on it, but he was oystering down towards Great Island. He was going round and round, but where he was at, I had never been on oyster. When he was coming there, he was checking, and I was about 2 miles from where I had been working, and I come by him. But I've had, I don't know how many trips I've made with observers, in the hundreds that I've made with observers on the boat, and I've not got no problem with carrying anybody. I mean, if anybody wants to go, I ain't never carried nobody oystering, but I've been in the scallop fisheries, the dogfish fisheries, the croaker fisheries, shrimp fisheries, and all of them, and I've carried plenty of observers on them. And I ain't got no problem. I think it would be better off to use your time. Because what dealing we've done with the commercial fishermen, with the state and the feds, with their equipment, they don't catch near as good as what commercial does. They don't have the stuff tuned up. They just go out there and try, and if it works the way it works, they call it. But we tune ours in to do the best it can do.
That's right.
And there's a lot of oysters right now that's planted on the stuff that the state is planted to grow in the swamp water area that hasn't been touched this year. In Jennifer Bay, there's, I don't know, 10 or 15 acres there. I went in there and tried it one day, and nobody's worked it all year. And you can get 2 baskets of digs right there. If you can stop and clean it up, they're burned up, muffled up, bad looking stuff. But it wouldn't be bad if you take your time and sit there and clean it up. You could get 2 bushels of lick right there, right now. And that's gonna close up this fall and not been worked this year.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Basically what they were saying, I mean, there's ones who worked when I was a little boy, want nothing, you go to them now, they throw them better than they ever have. I mean, that shit don't make sense to close it, I mean, all you're doing is killing the industry that young people like me depend on. I mean, it's all we know, all we're gonna do the rest of our life. And all y'all are trying to do is just kill it for all of us.
Can I ask for your name real fast, just for our?
Dylan Bland.
That everybody from the public that wants to speak. All right. Okay, we've got to hear on the clam plan. They got another presentation. And then the committee's gonna discuss a little more and we had to take a couple votes tonight.
Yeah, we appreciate y'all's
Yes, sir.
time.
Thank you. Yeah, we're gonna take a 5 minutes here, just to let everybody have a rest.
You know me, don't you?
Yeah.
So that's.
All right, let's try to get back going. I'll be in touch. Thank y'all.
Yeah, starting to go away from me here. 2015.
Nothing in my hand.
Okay.
Part-time job, several jobs, several years and
Whenever you're ready.
Ready?
Good evening, advisory committee members. My name's Lorena. I'm one of the plan co-leads, and Jeff Dobbs is here as well as the other co-lead. I will talk briefly on some key points from the hard plan base plan, and then we'll be focusing on the mechanical harvest issue paper and preliminary DMF management recommendations. So for your reference, same as oyster, this is where we are in the FMP development timeline. So we are here to review and receive public comment on draft amendment 3. I'll be going over the goal and objectives for hard clam and a characterization of the fishery, an overview of appendix 1 and DMF preliminary recommendations. The goal and objectives of amendment 3 were approved at the November 2023 MFC meeting. The goal of the North Carolina hard clam FMP is to manage the hard clam resource, to provide long-term harvest, and continue to offer protection and ecological benefits to North Carolina's estuaries. Currently, the available hard clam data comes from commercial landings, fish house sampling, and a recreational survey of cruffle holders. The recreational survey does not provide data for the entire recreational clam and fishing population, as you do not need a recreational license to harvest clams in North Carolina. Without complete recreational data, we cannot accurately estimate total removals. The issue was discussed earlier in the oyster plan, and it is a shared issue between both plans. This graph shows North Carolina commercial hard clam landings and trips from public bottom from 1994 to 2022. Landings and participation have been in steady decline across the entire time period, mainly due to market demand. So our focus today is appendix 1, which is the clam mechanical harvest issue paper. Habitat concerns associated with bottom disturbing gears have been an issue with mechanical clam harvest since its inception. The management of the fishery has always been a balance between these concerns and the value of the fishery. The number of participants and trips in the mechanical clam fishery on public bottom have steadily declined since the 1990s, the lowest level on record, drawing the habitat versus fishery value balance into question. The division believes the habitat value may now outweigh the fishery value for mechanical clam harvest. This, as well as the significant resources needed for the state to manage and monitor the fishery, has caused the division to re-examine the mechanical clam fishery. One of the primary concerns with mechanical clam harvest is the damage this harvest method can cause to habitat. Bottom disturbing gear, which includes dredges and trawls, cause physical damage to clams and their habitat. Soft bottom habitats have also been historically the most appropriate location to use bottom disturbing gear. However, organisms living in this habitat and adjacent habitats can be harmed by these gears. The mechanical gear used to harvest clams are escalator dredges and clam trawls. Current fishery regulations prohibit the use of mechanical gear on SAV beds and live oyster beds, and is only allowed in designated harvest areas because of the destructive capacity of the gear. Another habitat concern is sedimentation, as mechanical gear can create significant turbidity issues. Bottom disturbing gear can have negative impacts on clam beds and oyster reefs directly and indirectly. Direct effects include the physical damage caused by the gear, and indirect effects include the resuspension of sediment. High levels of suspended sediment can reduce successful settlement of larval clams and oysters and can smother shellfish by clogging their gills. These two maps depict two mechanical clam harvest areas, North River on the left and Vogue Sound on the right. From 1981 to 2021, a series of studies were conducted to map SAB beds across the state. The SAB maps generated from these studies were then overlaid onto the mechanical clam harvest area maps to look for areas of SAB overlap. The mechanical clam harvest areas were then adjusted to eliminate overlap and provide a buffer. An example of this overlap and area modification can be seen on the figure on the left of North River, where the red dotted line shows the new southern boundary line. On the right is the Bow Sound clam mechanical harvest area. And due to the large extent of overlap, this mechanical clam harvest area has been closed. These changes occurred after Amendment 2 in 2017. This is a graph showing mechanical clam landings from 1994 to 2022, shown in the gray bars. This also includes the number of participants in the fishery, depicted by the black line. Harvest during this time period peaked in 1995 at over 8.7 million clams, then declined to less than 100,000 clams in 2017. Participation mirrored a similar decline with 138 participants in 1996, then declining to less than 10 each year since 2017. This figure shows which water bodies account for the majority of the landings from 1994 to 2022 using mechanical gear. Mechanical clam harvest landings have been dominated by two water bodies, the New River shown in yellow and Core Sound shown in gray. Enforcement and maintenance of the designated mechanical clam harvest boundaries require substantial resources from the state. Each year, division staff marks all the mechanical clam harvest area boundaries with posts and signs to ensure enforceability of these boundaries. Staff replace all missing or damaged posts and signs that are affected by weather or vandalism. Additionally, Marine Patrol officers are required to monitor and enforce these areas. In Core Sound, the vast area open to mechanical clam harvest, along with its zigzagging boundary, makes enforcement difficult and resource intensive. The last piece of background that I'll go over is the allowance of mechanical harvest permitted prior to maintenance dredging. Through rule, the division allows the mechanical harvest of clams before maintenance dredging occurs in some of our navigational channels. The purpose of this rule is to allow commercial fishermen to access a resource that would otherwise be destroyed during the maintenance dredging process. This process requires collaboration between fishermen, the division, and Army Corps of Engineers. This rule has not been utilized since 2007, primarily because of the complicated process and limited interest. Now shifting into the socioeconomic analysis for this issue paper. Here's a table showing annual economic contributions from the mechanical clam commercial fishery for the last 11 years. From 2012 to 2022, ex-vessel values have varied from a high of approximately $285,000 in 2012 to a low of approximately $19,000 in 2020. The industry expanded in 2021, but has not returned to pre-2016 landings or participation, which has steadily declined over the period. Each year, the division uses a large number of staff and resources to monitor, manage, and enforce the fishery. These resources may be difficult to justify for a fishery with such diminished value. State resources may be better used to fund projects more beneficial to the clam fishery as a whole. In the background, we discussed mechanical clam harvest prior to maintenance dredging. If the mechanical clam harvest fishery on public bottom were to be discontinued, it's necessary to end the exception for mechanical harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging as currently allowed by rule. This would further benefit the habitat by reducing the extent of turbidity issues associated with mechanical gears. Again, this program has not been utilized since 2007. So I will now move into possible management options. Status quo would allow the fishery to continue to operate as it currently does. This would allow for the continuation of a historically significant fishery that provides important supplemental income to some users. The fishermen currently operating in the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation and enforcement would remain the same. Concerns about effects of bottom disturbing gears on structured habitats would not be addressed. Another option is to further limit mechanical clam harvest areas to improve enforceability and lessen habitat effects. This could be done by having boundary lines based on permanent structures and more rectangular in shape to also help with line of sight visibility. This was done in the North River, displayed here. Modified boundaries can also create buffers around critical habitats to protect them from sedimentation associated with bottom disturbing gears. As with status quo, the fishermen currently operating in the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation would be reduced, but the resources required for enforcement would likely remain the same. This would help address habitat concerns, but sedimentation would still occur from mechanical harvesting operations. The next management option would be a phase out of the mechanical clam fishery. Due to the requirements of the general statute listed here, the mechanical clam fishery cannot be ended abruptly upon adoption of this amendment. Outlined in the statute, an immediate closure of the fishery could result in severe curtailment of the usefulness or value of equipment in which fishermen have any substantial investment. Additionally, stated in the statute, this would require a future effective date as to minimize undue potential economic loss to fishermen. The mechanical clam fishery could be phased out over a set time frame, as was done with the Shellfish Relay Program. This option would allow fishermen currently operating in the fishery to continue during the phase-out period, but would discourage new participants. The phase-out period would allow current mechanical harvesters time to get rid of gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. This option would address the division's resource concerns with demarcation and enforcement, as well as habitat concerns. Regardless of the phase-out, mechanical gear can still be used in the private sector. After hearing concerns from the FMP Advisory Committee about participants wanting the ability to re-enter the fishery, the division recommended a phase-out timeframe of 3 years from adoption of this amendment, unless landings increase to at least 1 million clams and participation increases to at least 10 participants in the fishery in any year prior to 2027. 10 participants have not been active in a single year in the fishery since 2017. In 2022, there were 3 participants. The fishery last landed over 1 million clams in 2014, and in 2022, less than 200,000 clams were landed. This increase in landings and participation would show that the fishery is no longer diminishing and is valuable enough to maintain. This is a timeline if both triggers are met in any single year prior to 2027. This timeline would comply with the general statute. If the triggers are met, the issue would be brought back to the MFC for consideration at the May 2027 business meeting, or when participation and harvest estimates from 2026 are available. If the triggers are not reached, the phase out would be complete in May 2028. The phase out period gives fishermen 3 years to sell their gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. The last management option to be considered is discontinuing the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. This would end a program that has not been utilized since 2007. This would require a rule suspension, and this option could be pursued on its own or in conjunction with the phase out of the whole fishery mentioned previously. The division recommends a phase out to be completed 3 years from the adoption of this plan, unless fishery participation and landing triggers discussed previously are met, and to discontinue the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. These management options would only affect mechanical clam harvest from public bottom, and it would not affect their use on private bottom. Mechanical clam harvesting gear can still be used in the private sector. And that's all I got.
Any questions? Comments?
Question, the 3 participants, if it's not gonna violate any confidentiality laws, do you know where they were? Were they all in Core Sound or were they in New River?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
It really depends on, what the rotation is that year. When northern, basically, right now,
Well,
the
that's right.
fisheries is focused in core sound in the northern region, so when we open that northern part, that's when we'll see some participation there. When the main part of New River is open, we'll see participation there. Once in a while, we'll get a little bit of harvest in, the White Oak or the, intercoastal waterways. Haven't really seen much in the New Border, or, North Rivers lately.
So if you have three fishermen participate, does that mean you have three sets of gear essentially?
Yes.
That might change hands, or that might, different guy might go out, different fisher might go out some days, or.
Well, there's 3 people with trip tickets.
Okay.
So I can't speak to whether they're using separate gears. It could, I mean, they could be 2 on 1, or all 3 could be on a single, but from the water bodies, we know that it's occurring in different regions, and it really has changed year by year. It's not always the same people. There are some consistent folks, but we haven't really, there's not enough people to trend out there.
How much of a sample size is it?
Yeah.
Is there any updated information on participation, or is it just to 22? Because I live on the Intercoastal Waterway and I watch the clam dredger go by 3-4 times a week. You know, it's a big, obvious boat. Like, it looks very particular. You can't mistake it for something else. So I'd just be curious what the recent landings are before you try to close a fishery completely, or talk about closing a fishery completely in a 3-year phase out. Because what I see from my front porch is these boats are moving. But I don't see that data because it only goes back to 22.
Yeah, and then in this paper, every plan we cut off at a certain time period for the plan. We do have that data. The participation is still low. You might be seeing folks that are going to private leases to use that mechanical equipment, because that is permitted.
Yeah.
And this plan is public bottom only. Whether or not there's some inconsistency there between public and private bottom, that wouldn't be addressed here. That would have to be done.
Yeah.
The permit side.
I just know that I see that these boats are moving, which means obviously something's going on in this industry that's not reflective of the data that we're seeing here.
Yeah, it could be private, but we do have the 23.
And my other concern is when you talk about a 3-year phase out, it takes 2 to 4 years to even get barely a piece of an aquaculture lease. So I don't believe that a 3-year phase out is a realistic phase out to give people the opportunity to get into other clam fisheries as it's in this document. It takes longer to get through that process. And I know that they're 2 separate things, but that is something you have to consider when you're talking about, like they did in Florida and took away the gill netting and pushed everybody into the clams. But there was a big 3-year gap in between, because it takes a couple of years for clams to grow once you get through that 3-year process of getting the lease, if it goes smoothly and happens, everything comes on like clockwork. So don't believe that a 3-year phase out is a realistic time frame for people to transition their income or their supplemental income.
And that's something that you guys as an advisory committee can recommend. You guys can recommend different time frame.
So when you talk about private, you're talking about the private lease folks, there are that mechanical, can you give us any idea what the level of effort is on private leases with mechanical harvest, and what the impacts are on SAV and?
Well, it can't be in a primary nursery area. You can't have a lease in the SAV area, so you can't mechanically dredge in those habitats.
So it's varied year to year, but it's a similar level. There's not too many folks doing it. I think Zach was here. He provided some information at the commission meeting on this. And I think it was between like 3 and 7 in the past 10 years. In terms of habitat concerns, these leases are permitted and surveyed beforehand. So there can't be any SAV in order to even have the lease permitted. There should be some buffer, but I agree there's probably still some turbidity concerns with using this gear at all.
And you said that market is driving people out of this fishery. What's happened to the market? I still see clam chowder on the shelves, and you can still see it on the menus. What's happened to the market? What's happened that's caused the decline?
So I think Prasad touched on it. There was a precipitous decline in value of per clam when the gillnet fishery closed in Florida, and a lot of people went into clamming. That glut of clams into the market reduced its value, but it's been further exacerbated by the increase in oyster prices. It's kind of moved back and forth, which what people prefer, and right now folks are really into oysters. And in terms of aquaculture, we're really seeing that folks are focusing a lot more on oysters rather than clams. We've seen it used to be that market grades for clams had different values. A little neck was worth considerably more than a chowder. Now they're about even, is what we've heard. So, you know, clam for canning has the same value as something that you would have on a half shell at a restaurant. So it's telling you that there's not a big market for these nice, pretty high value clams.
I foresee a change in the clam industry, especially with the recent hurricanes in Florida over the last 3 years. Their clam industry has been devastated. If you look into any of the recent articles, research down there in Florida, is to expect that the market is going to look for clams elsewhere because Florida has had massive impacts after these back-to-back hurricanes and they're growing out. So that is something that we should consider as we move forward and talk about closing an industry that could potentially come back as the value of clams increase for us.
I noticed there's no mention of rulemaking changes or anything here, so does the mechanical clam harvest still managed by proclamation authority, or would that remain through the 3 years, or any plans? I know you were under some pressure to eliminate rules and stuff sometime in the year past.
Yeah, we've been avoiding rulemaking just because we're not as nimble in our ability to react to changing fisheries. So it would not require a rule change to discontinue the mechanical clam harvest fishery on the public bottom, except for the maintenance dredging rule that allows it. That small portion of it would need a rule suspension or eventually a change if we wanted to.
So if I may, the whole reason you're doing this is because of the participation rate, right?
No.
If that's the case, why don't you just put monitors on the boats, the 3 boats that do it? You'll know where they go by GPS tracking, and you'll know how often they go. And you don't have to send people after them or anything. I mean, you're not talking. Seems like this is kind of I understand you want to you're worried about bottom damage, but with only 3 of them, are we really, this one to me seems problematic. You know, it seems like there's easier ways to fix this issue or identify if it's a resource issue from that. And I know other states, because I'm on the Southeast Fisheries Management Board, I know other states use monitoring systems with boats because they can track them and determine how often they're out there and all that type of stuff from it. So there's ways to do that would be a pretty limited investment up front and would solve any manpower issues.
Along those, I'm sorry. I just to respond to that, this is the main. If we go back to Lorena's slide, where we first broached the issue. So
It'll take me 1 second to get it up. Hold on.
okay, yep, no problem. So as she stated, it's always been a balance between habitat value and fishery value. And as the fishery value declines, we need to focus on the habitat value here. And the Marine Fisheries Commission has tasked us through the CHIP to look into bottom disturbing gears. They're known to be damaging to habitats through physical damage and through turbidity and sedimentation issues. So this is a suite of issues we're looking at. There's habitat concerns, there's the diminished value of the fishery, but there's also the demarcation, monitoring, and enforcement concerns. So it's not just one thing, it's this group of things has caused us to re-examine it. We've been tasked to look at how we can remove bottom disturbing gears. And this looks like a prime example to re-examine it at this point.
Well, the participation you can do, as I mentioned, the other item about the value, to me, it goes back to the value of it. I just look at with 3 people, even with that, I don't see you damaging a lot of bottom with 3 mechanical dredges, especially given their size. They do about 30 feet wide at the time max, if I understand it correctly. It's been a long time since I've been around a clam dredge. I think I was like 14 years old. That was a long time ago. And so from that, understood. Okay.
To that point, it seems like this is low hanging fruit for picking off a bottom disturbing, potentially harmful fishing method. And there isn't a lot of impact with only 3 participants. The concern would be if it grows back. And it seems like we're opening the door for growth back into this fishery, which to me seems to be a little bit counter to what we're trying to achieve, and what sort of where we're going, the direction we're going with this is to try to remove a harmful, a fishing method that's harmful to habitat, particularly relative to value at this point. But if we can, if it's closed relatively painlessly now, very, very much more painlessly because there's so few participants, that it seems a little counterintuitive to me to, at this point, include in the plan the option to open it back up if we see increased participation, and by sort of in fact encouraging increased participation to keep the door open. So that's something that I just think needs more consideration.
And I will say, the encouragement may be an unintended consequence of this. Originally, we did not have a re-examination trigger, but we heard from the public that they wanted an opportunity, that the fishermen wanted an opportunity to move back into this gear. And if that fishery value were to suddenly skyrocket, and we could find a balance between habitat value and fishery value, there could be an argument made. But that would be completely the decision of the commission. And this committee could choose to recommend this without that trigger if they sought it.
Okay. Are there, very quick, I know we're running over, but are there other harvest methods? There are other harvest methods for clams that are not as harmful, correct? That aren't
Yeah, the hand arms.
Yeah.
So you have rakes, you have tongs, you have hand clamming, signing.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging my with that comment.
Sure,
that's why we're here.
My other question was, I know in July when we looked at the data, we had talked about looking at certain ratios in it to see where. Well, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. I'm so sorry.
You're too young for that, Adam.
Yeah, no, I did. We had a note that we looked at these data points for the clams.
Possibly talk about demographics. We did talk about that.
No, it wasn't demographics. If it goes back to me, I'll mention that. I apologize.
Okay, we've had some discussion on the clam issue. And so, sure. Any public comment? No? And so, we're tasked tonight with recommending a management option for each of the plans. And so, I almost want to do this in reverse since we just talked about clams, so that we can just knock that item off the list and then just go back to oysters. So I'm entertaining any motion from any member. on specifically to the clam plan.
So Mike, if you don't mind real fast, I can share the screen that kind of shows what the management options are for claim and what the division recommendation is.
Great.
And then as Jeff and Lorena both said, the number 3 there under management options to phase out. We have listed there the 3-year phase out with contingency triggers. The committee, any member is more than welcome to make a motion with changes to that. Commissioner Service, if you wanted to make a motion to phase out mechanical clam harvest without those contingency triggers, you're welcome to do that. Versailles, if you wanted to extend that phase out period, if you wanted to make a motion for that, you were welcome to do that. It's entirely up to the committee.
One question, and then I'd like to make a motion, I think. So if we go through the 3 years, there's no increase, we phase out clam kicking, mechanical clam harvest. It's likely that the mechanism to put it back in place would still exist in an amendment to the plan at a later date. Is that the true statement?
Yes, it's proclamation authority, so.
Proclamation authority would still exist. I'll make a motion that the committee go along with the division recommendations 3 and 4.
We're looking for a second.
Second motion.
Second by Mr. Wilson.
Jesse, could you add in the maintenance dredging portion that's option that one?
Maintenance dredging was a nice idea that never panned out. From the beginning, it never panned out at all.
No participation.
It was a little difficult to get everything coordination, and it was difficult to sample. And they didn't want us to the fishermen didn't want us to open areas where there weren't any clams, and if we did, and we caught hell for that. And so it never worked in any way.
Is that the motion as you made it?
Yes.
Okay. Any discussion?
Should that reference options 3 and 4, just so there's no confusion?
I absolutely can.
Thinking about what might confuse me. It's just. Thank you.
Any discussion? If none, I'm gonna call the question here. Can I get a roll call? Jeff?
Certainly can. Let me have to move some stuff around on the screen here that's not showed up here. All right, so Birch is absent. He's absent.
Mr.
Mike
Parsons
Parsons?
here. He's present.
I'm present. Thank you.
Partisan?
Yes,
So,
sir.
We called this, just for clarification, we called the vote, so it's.
Oh, yeah. I'm a aye.
Okay.
Marshall?
Yes.
Commissioner Mustin?
Nay.
Tim Willis?
Aye.
Brett Wilson?
Aye.
William Service?
Aye.
And Mike
I'm
White?
sorry, I'm gonna abstain.
I'll abstain. The motion passes 4-1 to 2. And there's 4 to 8. Anyway, okay, thank y'all for that. Now we got another decision to make. We're gonna go back to the oyster plan. And Jesse, or if you bring that same,
And so the first thing we have here, and this is actually relevant to both the clam plan and the oyster plan. And you're welcome to make two separate motions if you want to, or contain it all into one. And it's about the recreational harvest and whether or not you'd like to recommend that the commission endorse the division, exploring potential options and solutions for a recreational shellfish license or permit.
you want to handle this just as one isolated motion, so it's not confusing in the other main motion when it comes to sustainable harvest or whatever, like, not this permit. Is that, are you okay with that? Okay, so we're gonna handle it two separate motions. We'll handle this one independently.
Sorry.
And I'll entertain any motion.
I make a motion to support the EMF recommendation.
And I actually have that wording up here, and I'm gonna just copy it straight over.
Sure. Yeah, it's up to you.
Would not.
I'll second.
Mr. Marshall seconds. Mr. Service, original motion made.
And Commissioner Service, if you just want to make sure that the motion is you.
Looks good. Y'all look all the way down, Jesse. Yeah, no, that looks good.
Okay, any discussion on this?
So with this is just recommending that it doesn't include the mechanism, like there's no set mechanism right now to how to do that step.
The one appropriate mechanism. Clear, good, correct. Okay. Okay, roll call vote, Jesse, let's get this over with.
Mr. Hardison?
I'm a aye.
Mr. Marshall?
Aye.
Ms. Mustin?
Aye.
Mr. Willis?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Service?
Abstain.
And Commissioner Blanton?
Abstain. And the motion passes, yeah, to scroll back.
It's 5 to 2.
5 to 2,
Or
Or
5
5
with
to-
2 abstentions.
5 to none to 2 extensions. Right.
Yep.
We have,
We do. Yes.
Switch back to this other screen. And the next thing we have here is the deep water oyster recovery areas. The division has recommended adopting the deep water oyster recovery areas. And Mike, y'all are welcome to have one motion to address the strategy 1, the deep water oyster recovery area, strategy 2, the culture supported harvest, and strategy 3, the rotational culture sites, or we can go through them one by one if you'd like also.
It's the pleasure of the, would y'all like to vote on all three options as one motion? Or would you like to go option by option and vote each as individual motion?
Individual.
I believe that would be the most appropriate. So we're gonna go through this individually and we'll take 3 motions per option. Or take a motion per option. And so, again, I'll entertain any motion.
I would motion for status quo until there's more information on the Doras as far as their boundary lines, what the triggers would be for allowing it to open up again. That was really unclear today. It sounded like things kind of close and stay closed. So I would like a little more information there before I'd be willing to agree to anything else.
Looking for a second.
I'll second.
Mr. Marshall, second. Discussion.
Could we be reminded what status quo is?
So right now, if this did not pass, status quo would be, there would be no deep water oyster recovery areas and they would be treated the same in management. However, if the status quo would stay exactly the same, if you adopt the second one, they just become part of that second approach. So there would just be no differentiation between those deep water areas and how we manage the rest of the oysters and Hamilton Sound in those areas.
Would that allow you guys to coach on the deep water oysters? Do they go into the same category?
We would still, either way, if it was a recovery area or not, we would still need to pursue different permitting. So it's possible, just not under our current permitting that we have.
Yeah, so one of my issues with the deep water oyster recovery area is that you're just sort of leaving it to the whim for nature to kind of do its thing. And so with the onset of what's coming off of the land and draining into the water and the landfalling hurricanes, it's like a roll of the dice, a shot in the dark on whether you're going to get any recovery out of that or not. I could see being more supportive of it if there was going to be in turn culch planting on top of the closed area to try to build that deep water reef back. I could understand and be probably more supportive of the idea of having some deeper areas that are closed. But with the lack of permitting that you mentioned to have access to culch these deep areas, it's hard to imagine the area recovering totally within its natural self without the help of human intervention, just because what we know about oysters and what we know about the environment in that deep water and how hypoxic it can be. And so that would be my heartburn against doing something like that, is if we're not going to help the area in our ways possible to sort of encourage that growth and that, because that's a monumental thing for nature to do, is to grow this reef back 13 foot off the bottom right by itself. I just don't know that it has the capacity. And I don't know that Division has the answer that it has the capacity either, because I've never heard that y'all say, if this were to happen, it's going to guarantee come back.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be 13 feet. It just needs to be over that kind of.
Right, I get that. But I mean, you know what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not, shooting for the moon here, but that would be my comment toward this particular motion and toward the DORAs.
Would there be a potential to, for example, in the easiest enforceable way to split, for example, the DORAs, almost allowing, for example, one section to be a control? That way we could actually see over time how effective the strategy is. And I guess based on that, it sounds like the drainage and water quality, that stuff might be out of the Division's hands. That is a whole different sector. But this would be the only, I think it's more of a situation of we can control what we can control, and this is only what we can control. And I think the idea of control, to compare could potentially be effective.
As a committee, you could make that motion for, to modify those boundaries. But I will say, just from the public feedback we're getting, I anticipate there may be some modifications, some suite of options that are presented in the future when it comes to the commission.
I like his idea, and in a way, you don't have control, but the Neuse River produces so infrequently that it is almost a control. I mean, and you could, that would be, if you were gonna close part of it, that's what I would close, because back in the sixties, they used to allow harvest of undersized oysters in the Neuse River because they never lived long enough to get to 3 inches. So that's been since the '60s. So that was very appealing. That made a lot of logical connections with me. That idea.
Are we, by a control and a case of control, are you talking about allowing harvesting in one of the stores?
No,
Or just planting a culture in one area?
Well, I meant closing versus, allowing harvests in, for example, an adjacent area.
So I will say, last night at the Southern Advisory Committee, one of the motions that they passed regarding the deepwater oyster recovery areas was something similar to that idea of, they recommended to the commission to adopt a much narrower, I think the wording they used was a significantly narrower area for that deepwater oyster recovery area closure, in order to see the effectiveness. The idea was the same, Brett, is the idea that you had.
I mean, is the objective of establishing these areas, is it an experiment, or is it to reestablish deep water reefs?
The goal would be to recover deep water reefs until we could potentially put culture on there. The only way we have is to let them grow and not remove whatever accretion we can get, a little bit that we do get before they die. So like right now, if it's open, whatever has grown potentially will be harvested, and that little bit of gain we got will be removed in this season, and then it'll take however long to gain up again, where if it wasn't removed, even if they died, you still have that material there, the shells kind of stuck together for spat to settle on. So it's, definitely a very slow incremental process if there's to be natural recovery.
I've been going through the literature, and the reports of these reefs being knocked down and not being able to recover because of hypoxic events has been repeated over and over and over again. It doesn't seem to me we need another experiment. We know when you knock these reefs down, and we're in an environment where the conditions are that hypoxic events occur with some frequency, the reefs are not going to recover. We know that. And I don't think we have any reason to believe that hypoxic events are going to become less frequent, or that because of the pollutants that are entering the estuaries, nor are we should we expect air temperatures and therefore water temperatures to go down. It seems to me the experiments are there. There is loads and loads of data about the effect, and you guys know better than anyone of the effect of dredging on the vertical extent of the reefs, and as a result, their vulnerability to hypoxic events, which are becoming more and more frequent. And if we don't give them a chance, we're not, they're not going to grow back. As far as culch planning goes, and I was thinking we were talking maybe about a culch site, one culch area and one non-culch area. Does your culch planning include a vertical component? I know they make structures that are used for reef building. I know CCA is doing some of that. But is there a vertical component to the culch building that you're doing now, or is it mostly just substrate?
So the current culture program plants material and a thin veneer. It's typically sites are selected in areas that are no deeper than 6-8 feet.
Yeah.
Typically.
Yeah.
So there's no component where we're trying to build up.
Which is maybe why you didn't consider doing culture planting in these stores? Was that part of the decision making
It's
maybe?
currently not within our permit for cold planting.
From permit from,
That's the US
GM.
Army Corps of Engineers.
I think my interpretation of what we're doing was not going against the habitat thing. I was thinking that they want proof that this is gonna work. So, I mean, let's set it aside and look at it for a few years, and if we do see some relief, we know it's worked, then we got justification. But like everybody said, if you don't put culture on it, it's gonna take not eons, but an extremely long time to put any of that to happen, so.
You mentioned the, I think you called it hash or something, that when you bust up the shelf and it's lines about, is that in place now, or has that been covered by sediment? Does not that act like culch? Is that not
It does,
similar to culch?
so spat will set on that, and I mean, I think that's what's happened out, they'll grow, and so the thought is, if, when they die and break up, it becomes that hash and kind of sped up by mechanical harvest, so if there wasn't any sort of disturbance, it would allow those shells to stay together better, maybe more cemented if accrete on top of each other, instead of then having to start from basically ground zero again.
But just a note, hash occurs in Newport River and New River from hand harvesting activities as well. So it's not just dredging that.
So for harvest activities.
Yeah.
But it serves the similar purpose as culch.
Yeah,
Is that right?
It's just small pieces of culch.
Yes. Which
you'd be enhancing or I can't think of the word, but you'd be adding to that with the culch. Is that correct? On top of those old reefs.
If material was put on top of the old reefs, it'd be on top of that. So that's one criteria for culch planting, is that currently we're not permitted to, and you probably wouldn't want to plant on top of the existing oyster resource, right? So that's another limiting factor why nothing's ever been put out there. Is
exactly.
So you don't foresee being able to get the permits to be able to culch these, you just want to protect them?
I don't know, I think discussions today, with the, section chief of that section, it's something that's a possibility in the future, but that's totally we can look into, but right now it's not possible under the current permit. Doesn't mean we couldn't in the future, but right this second, we could go out there, tomorrow and do it.
And could I understand again, what is this is an area that's not producing, it says it right in the FMP, it is a non-producing area, and obviously there are no reefs, there are no vertical reefs.
What we were told during the summer AC was that once every 5 to 8 years, they're able to harvest oysters in these areas.
In
the Neuse River specifically.
So Pamlico, and this year happens to be, we're in that year where there's productive oyster reefs out there that are harvestable under our current management.
In the doors.
Yes.
And it takes 2 to 3 years for a baby oyster to become a full-grown oyster. So you can't just look at 1 year's data. You really have to kind of look at the 3 year, because even if it's being dredged on, it's still substrate for more spat to set on if there's a good set that spring does.
So I guess that's the kind of thought behind not having mechanical harvest there, is that harvest can remove oysters faster than they're growing naturally out there because it's so intermittent.
Yeah, so passive a dredge will remove about 34 centimeters of vertical height, about a foot.
If it goes over the top of it.
If
but typically you're aiming for the side of it, not the top of it. Like that's how you dredge for oysters. You don't want to dredge over the top of the oyster reef. That would not be, it wouldn't go in your bucket, essentially.
But if those oysters are growing, we would expect them to with some vertical development, would we not? And that would take more than 3 or 4 years, correct?
Yeah, so as he said, the studies that have been done, how much materials removed by mechanical harvest, it was kind of one season removed 34 centimeters of reef height. And to kind of give you how much an oyster grows, right? A legal oyster is 8 centimeters. So And that can take up to 3 years in those subtidal areas to grow that 8 centimeters. So it has the potential of removing more than can naturally grow. And then so that's in the shallower areas where we're planting mulch, we're making up for that removal by adding more material. So in those deep water areas, we haven't added any more material, and it just can't grow fast enough to keep up with between harvest and the anoxic events that we don't have any control over.
And the fishermen leave it alone in the off years. When it's not producing, they're not gonna go there to dredge.
Correct.
If it's not harvestable age yet, then they're gonna go somewhere else to look for their oysters. So why would you take that spot away from them 5 years from now?
So the thought behind kind of this strategy is that it would prioritize oysters for oysters' sake, that shell material, the habitat. Acknowledging that, yes, there's a value there, a fishery value that we are no longer allowing to be harvested, and saying that the value of oysters as a habitat is greater. That's what's proposed in the strategy. Whether or not it's adopted or agreed upon, that's just what that says.
The relative immediate value of the fishery in those areas, we're trying to compare relatively immediate fishing value versus future fishing value.
But it hasn't been viable for the last 5 years, which would be your most recent data. So we're not looking at fair data. Because we're not looking at harvest based on when the reef was producing harvestable oysters. We're looking at harvest over the last 5 years when it hasn't been of harvestable size.
Yeah, I mean, we acknowledge that it's, intermittent, so it takes a certain amount of time, and then it is harvestable, and there's stuff out there, and then it's harvested, or, there's an event and it dies.
So just as a clarification there, we're not, the comparison wouldn't be looking at previous harvests off of those rocks. We can't even distinguish from our trip data where that's at, just so.
But we're talking about taking it away based on lack of participation or lack of landings.
No, for the oyster, these deep water oyster recovery areas, creating them and not allowing mechanical harvest on them is solely as a habitat protection measure. And that's to kind of address, not kind of, goals set up in the coastal habitat protection plan that identify mechanical harvest gear, particular bottom disturbing gear, as the most destructive, and instructs us to look for ways to minimize those impacts. So those deep water oyster reefs, since they are vulnerable to those hypoxic events, and there's no culture planting going on, they are the most vulnerable oysters to mechanical harvest. So as far as impacting their ability to sustain themselves and recover. Whereas in those shallow bays, we don't see those hypoxic events. We're adding culture material, and the primary threat in there is really sedimentation. So
we're taking away the commercial industry for the research experiment of the Dora, or however we want to phrase the 2 pieces of Dora or 2 pieces together. Essentially,
yes,
it's going more for research and maybe protecting the environment if it works out in the future. Because there's not a lot of research or data that shows that these reefs come back.
Not explicitly for research, but explicitly for valuing oyster habitat over the oyster fishery value of those oysters.
And if I could ask, there are 0 vertical reefs that have the relief they had 50 years ago, 3-4 meters in deep water reefs. There are 0 in Pamlico Sound. Is that correct? That are known?
All of whenever they've gone back to look at them, the relief, there's very little low relief reefs. There's no high relief reefs left.
None left in Pamlico Sound.
The only ones are the sanctuaries we've constructed.
And so what we're trying to do is reconstruct. We're trying to at least give some opportunity for redevelopment of those vertical reefs somewhere in Pamlico Sound where they have been. And it's strictly a matter of harvest that's knocked those reefs down. Correct. I did have a question about the stability of the reef. In an anoxic event, when the oysters on the lower tier of the reef die, will they still support the reef and the oysters oysters in the upper strata?
So,
And is that sort of sustainable? Can that stay that way for a while?
I mean, the shells do have a, fixed lifespan, and it depends on if there's eroders like boring sponge, and there's variability in how long the shells last. But if a cemented reef together is gonna be more stable than one that's been broken down or that's just kind of oysters on the surface of shell hash, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay,
Chairman, please call the question.
I'm getting ready.
Wait, one more question.
Okay, I think we've had a lot of discussion on this.
Mike, can I just clarify with Preside that this is the motion that you would like up here? Is there anything you would like?
No, I'm good with that until there's more information or more detailed, like, is the Dora a sanctuary? Is it not a sanctuary? Where does it line up? I would want more information before I tried to share that with other people.
Okay, Jesse, roll call.
Mr. Hardison?
Nay.
Mr. Marshall?
Aye.
So is that
Aye.
Ms. Mustin?
Aye.
Mr. Willis?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Nay.
Commissioner Service?
Abstain.
Commissioner Blanton?
Abstain. Motion passes 3-2. 2 abstentions. Okay. Next option, strategy. Here, where we are.
So the next strategy 2, is the culture supported harvest. The division's recommendation is to adopt the proposed culture supported harvest strategy.
Entertaining a motion.
Move to support the division's recommendation.
I'll second.
Second, or, yeah.
And Mr. Marshall, is that the motion? Is you?
Yes.
So from what I understand, this motion is quite a bit, this strategy is quite a bit more interactive than what we have in place at the moment, right? To allow
There's that
a
official.
lot more predictability in what the season length will be.
Yes.
As in, because, so right now we're depending on information from the fishermen to go and gather oysters to stay above the 26% threshold. And so this strategy also incorporates communication with the fishermen to ensure that season length can be established by finding oysters where these fishermen, and so this is where I get confused on where this strategy is different or more favorable than the strategy we have in place currently.
So this strategy would, at the beginning, the proclamation would say there's going to be 10 weeks of season. Well, right now it says it's open, and then it may close in 2 weeks if we get the sampling that shows it's, we have 2 consecutive sampling events below that 26%, it will close. So, and that's based on our sampling, which should be following where the fishing's occurring. So this, at the very beginning, would be like, there is going to be 10 weeks of season in the Dare area, 10 weeks of season in the Hyde area. The bays are going to get 6 weeks. The deep water Pamlico is going to get 4 weeks, or whatever, however it pans out based on the sampling. And then we have one sampling event. So instead of going out there every 2 weeks chasing it around, we go out mid-season, reevaluate, kind of see what the condition's at, and if it's looking like it's tracking what we predicted where it should be. If our table says there's 3 weeks of season left, and yep, there's 3 weeks of season left, we're great. If the table says actually there should be 10 weeks of season left, we modify and give more length to the season, and then that's it. When it's done, it's done. So there is the one big difference here is the current approach is there's potential to reopen if those oysters grow into being legal. It hasn't reopened. We haven't done that. It's been infrequent, but it does happen. This, once it's closed, it would be closed once we did those two events. So that is the cost there. But I think to me, the benefit is that there's really so much more certainty in the beginning of this is what you're going to get.
Gotcha.
And also it does incorporate that official mechanism, like please, but it does put the onus on the industry to contact us instead of the other way around. So which we heard comment about that tonight, but that's officially in there where the mechanism for them to provide information to us.
And Mr. Marshall can attest that once upon a time that did occur.
Yes.
I'm making a mistake. Any questions or anything further about this? Okay, Jesse.
Right. Mr. Hardison,
Aye.
Mr. Marshall,
Aye.
Ms. Mustin,
Aye.
Mr. Willis,
Aye.
Mr. Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Service,
Abstain.
and Commissioner Bland.
Abstain. Motion passes without dissent. Okay, we got one more item.
So we actually have two more items.
Two more items.
Because y'all passed, y'all supported the coach supported harvest strategy, there's an adaptive management component that we can come to after we get to the, after we do this third strategy. All right, so strategy 3 is the rotational culch sites, and the division's recommendation is to adopt the rotational culch site strategy.
I think this is the most straightforward of them all. And so 10-acre sites, 4 per management area, 4 management areas, one's gonna be open every year. And they get an entire season to work on that piece.
Yeah, this one, we've already demonstrated success in other states, mentioned Maryland and Virginia has had success in rotational.
Yeah, so this is what Virginia and Maryland prize their fisheries on is rotational stuff. I mean,
There was
they
really
plant,
good
they let it
data
sit.
that they provided to us this summer on that information too.
Is it
Like really
rotational
solid.
culch or is it rotational?
Yeah, they plant
on
and rotate.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's called on culch trees.
Yeah. But you can read more about it, but it's they use this strategy behind it. So any more discussion on it? Any questions? Okay, Jesse?
I don't believe we have a motion.
Oh, we don't have a motion?
I'll say,
I'll motion.
motion what it says.
I'll motion.
I thought we had already had a motion.
Mike, which motion would you, there's a couple.
Whoever. I
The
think,
division's recommendation,
Yeah,
the
she
highlighted
was the
section on
first.
the last page.
and
Sorry, I'm not looking at it, I don't remember exactly what it said,
Second.
but. The
Second.
Second. All right, now we can call
Mr. Hardison,
Aye.
Mr. Marshall,
Aye.
Ms. Mustin,
Aye.
Mr. Willis,
Aye.
Mr. Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Service,
Abstain.
and Commissioner Blandon.
abstain. Okay. Now we got to discuss, debt management.
And Joe and Bennett, would y'all like me to pull up, the slide specific to adaptive management to get that information back up also? It'll take me 1 second to find that exact slide here.
So basically, what the adaptive management's saying, if there's a big change, greater than 25% in either direction in participation in the mechanical fishery, and it outlines that we calculate that during the annual FMP update, and it's a running 3-year average, so like one anomaly won't impact them. If the 3-year average changes by more than 25%, they trigger the division to go back and just re-examine our fixed season lengths that we have come up with, and it's table 10 in the paper or whatever, to reevaluate if they're either too conservative or too narrow based on what the participation has shifted. So a ton of people got in, it's kind of a fail safe for us to be able to dial it back. Or if people just dropped out and no one's doing it anymore, we can open it a lot more, add more time instead of having to wait to that second in-season sampling right off the bat and just stretch it out. And that this, I mean, it's a 5-year period between plans. It's, you know, a 3-year average. This hasn't changed, it hasn't fluctuated in that 25% during that entire time since 2000, when it stabilized, 2013, I think. So it's, unless something big happens in the fishery, it probably won't even come into play. But it's just that fail safe there if a ton of people jump in. And initially we did have in consultation with the advisory committee, but that may have been too slow to actually react. So we took that out. But if, you know, in consultation, coming back with the commissioner advisory committee is more palatable, you can make a motion to put that in.
Any questions? Okay, I'll entertain the motion.
Move to support the division's recommendation.
I'll second.
That's it. Okay. Yeah, I can second as well.
My take on it is you can't really have one without the other. And so, I appreciate the division giving some outliers and some thresholds there, you know, because that's important in the adaptive management. Anyway.
Just to make certain, that was a second by Tim Willis, correct?
That was. Okay, Jesse.
All right, Mr. Hardison,
Aye.
Mr. Marshall,
Aye.
Ms. Mustin,
Aye.
Mr. Willis,
Aye.
Mr. Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Service,
Abstain.
Commissioner Blank.
Abstain. Okay. About an hour passed. That's okay.
It won't be late.
So I'm gonna ask that if there's any issues from our AC members. You got anything you'd like to address right here at the moment?
The only thing I would say is like, I'm interested in the Doras, but I just think that there needs to be a little more structure for that to be palatable. A little more information on what triggers it, what doesn't. That would be it.
Mr. Willis, Mr. Hardison, y'all good to go? Anything?
We're good to go.
Yes,
Happy
sir.
to-
All good. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank y'all for being here online. That's a tough job too.
Yep.
Okay, I'm motion to adjourn.
Mike, if you don't mind, can I
Sure.
just briefly mention one thing? I'll try to be very quick. If I'm quick enough, we can be out of here before the Southern was last night, so did you job well, Mike? Just a brief update, the commission in November, selected their preferred management options for the spotted sea trout, fisheries management plan, amendment 1 of that plan. I won't go into detail about what those preferred management options were here. If you have any questions about it or anything, feel free to contact me and I can get you in touch with the species leads or anything. The commission will be voting on final adoption for that plan at their February meeting. And I do briefly just want to also talk about kind of the 2025 schedule for y'all's meetings. There's some changes that we're hoping to try to at least test out for the meetings. We're wanting to start having a virtual meeting, a joint meeting of all the different ACs at once about a week prior to when you would meet in person to actually deliberate and vote. And what that would be is, for example, if we had done it for oyster clam for this slate of AC meetings, it would be a virtual meeting a week ago where y'all would have received the presentations that y'all received tonight. at that virtual meeting, asked the questions, had the kind of back and forth with the leads. And then at the in-person meeting a week later, it would just be an in-person meeting just like this one of an individual committee. Y'all would deliberate and vote on the options then. And the idea behind that, I'd like that I have a little bit of theme music. I feel like that's trying to tell me to shut up and it's not gonna listen to it. The idea behind that is y'all actually have a little bit more time to digest the information, because it's a lot.
Sorry, guys.
Didn't even hear mine going off.
Would Jesse, would most of the discussion, the back and forth that we've been having now, would most of that occur online?
I think most of it would likely occur in person. The online portion would be questions that were specific to the presentation, most likely.
So we get the presentations online and then that discussion.
Yeah. And there would be time when you got the presentations for questions that were specific to the presentations and just about the data itself.
Yeah. And we'd get copies of the presentations too, I assume.
Yes, sir. And the actual presentations, the way we kind of live stream to the public, these would be live streamed to the public as well. And they're automatically available, the recordings of them on YouTube. So you could go back and rewatch the presentations because they are a ton of fun. So I'm sure you're going to want to watch them multiple times.
Well, you guys do a good job of like formatting them and making them readable. That's actually good useful.
Well, we appreciate that. And Mike, that's all I have.
Okay, yes. Anybody, so I'm good to go for an adjournment, right? Need a motion?
moved.
Okay. Seconded.
Everybody in favor, get up and leave.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prasad, for coming. It's nice to have you on the committee. It's awesome.
Yeah.